accidental group chats getting leaked to America rattling a saber at Greenland and threatening to annex Canada, and tariffs and reciprocal tariffs between the US and the EU, over the past year, transatlantic relations have fallen apart faster than anyone feared. And at the center of it is an alliance that has underpinned Western security for 3/4 of a century. NATO is under pressure it hasn't faced since the Cold War, but this time the call is coming from inside the House. The administration that is supposed to lead it is now openly questioning whether it's worth having at all. So what is NATO? What isn't NATO? How did it come to exist? And has it actually been worth it for the US? Let's dig into it. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was created in the aftermath of World War II, and before we get into the specifics, it's worth understanding how catastrophic that war actually was. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died, around 3% of the entire population of the world. Entire cities were leveled, and the economies of France, Germany, Italy, and much of Eastern Europe were in ruins. And the two superpowers left standing, the US and the Soviet Union, had completely opposite visions of what the world should look like after the war. The Soviet Union moved quickly to install friendly Soviet-aligned, read as communist governments across Eastern Europe: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. One by one, they all fell behind what Winston Churchill later called the Iron Curtain. And the question in Western capitals like London, Paris, and Washington was a really uncomfortable one. Where does it stop? If you're following along so far, hit subscribe. Every week I'll explain topics that affect the US and/or Europe in a way that's hopefully easy to follow, or if you have a topic you'd like me to break down, drop it in the comments. But now let's get back to transatlantic cooperation. NATO's first leader, or Secretary General, was the British diplomat Hastings Ismay, who summed up NATO's mission as to, quote, keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. To help keep the Soviets out, NATO was formally established in April of 1949 with 12 founding members: the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, Portugal, and Italy. So pretty much all of Europe that had been liberated by or allied with the US in World War II. After the fall of Nazi Germany in 1945, there were compelling voices, including British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and American General George Patton, openly discussing the possibility of taking the fight to the Soviet Union while the Allied armies were still mopping up in Europe. But instead of immediately starting World War III, thankfully cooler heads prevailed and a deterrence was envisioned. NATO provided it. So to keep the Soviets out, you had to keep the Americans in. And that wasn't a guarantee. After the First World War, the United States retreated back into isolationism. Congress refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. America declined to join the League of Nations, the organization that President Woodrow Wilson himself had championed as sort of a beta version of the UN. And when Europe descended into chaos again in the 1930s, the US watched from the sidelines until it had no choice to get involved. So European leaders after the war had every reason to believe America might do the same again. So NATO was designed in part to make American involvement in European security permanent rather than politically optional. And why keep the Germans down? Well, the Allied powers had just spent the better part of a decade and tens of millions of lives defeating a rearmed and militarized Germany for the second time in 30 years. Nobody was prepared to let that happen for a third time, so they split Germany down the middle. West Germany was created in 1949, carved away from Soviet-dominated Berlin and Eastern Germany, and anchored firmly to the west. But its military potential still made its neighbors deeply uneasy. NATO served as the framework that absorbed and constrained German rearmament after the war, rather than leaving it unchecked, and for an entire decade after the war, NATO served as the de facto military for West Germany. Now, Europe couldn't accomplish any of this on its own. The countries that weren't bombed into near oblivion were either too indebted to sustain their military commitments or too politically unstable to respond to crisis. So all this means the only way to keep the Soviet Union out means the US had to be in. At the peak of Cold War tensions, the US had 475,000 military personnel stationed in Europe, primarily in Germany because I suppose they still needed to be kept down. And that number today is closer to 80,000, reduced as the immediate threat of a Soviet invasion stopped in the 90s, and as technology made long-range force projection more practical, like long-range aircraft or drones today. So none of this, NATO, deterrence, keeping the Soviets out, would work without the massive arsenal of freedom that the US had built during World War II, including nuclear weapons. So for much of the past 75 years, Both major American political parties have been broadly pro-NATO, and that bipartisan support had some logic to it. Republicans, traditionally more hawkish on defense, saw NATO as their primary roadblock against Soviet expansion. The whole point was to keep tank columns from crossing past the Elbe River, which served as the unofficial border between Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe and the more democratic West. Democrats, more focused on multilateralism and international institutions, valued the alliance as a framework for collective security. And both parties, at various times, have pushed back on European defense spending. From Eisenhower to Obama, American presidents complained that European allies were free-riding on American security guarantees while building out generous welfare states at home. And that criticism hasn't been entirely wrong. But here's the important distinction. Every one of those presidents, Republican and Democrat alike, pushed for more European spending while maintaining committed to the alliance itself, and that's different from what we're seeing now. The current argument coming from the Trump administration isn't only that Europe should pay more, it's that the alliance itself may not be worth the American commitment at all. Trump's views on NATO aren't a secret, and they weren't a surprise before the last election. In 2018, Fox News host, at least at the time, Tucker Carlson asked him directly, quote, "So let's say Montenegro, which joined last year in 2017, is attacked. Why should my son go to Montenegro to defend it?" And Trump's answer wasn't a resounding defense of collective security. He said Montenegro was a tiny country with very aggressive people, and they might drag the US into World War III, so you could say he's not all for it. These aren't complaints about burden sharing. They are expressions of a fundamental skepticism towards the alliance's basic premise, which is collective defense. At the core of NATO is Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. It states essentially that an attack against one member is considered an attack on all members, and each member is obligated to respond with such actions it deems necessary. And every member decides for itself what that response looks like. There's no automatic obligation to go to war or to put boots on the ground. But the deterrent effect, the idea that attacking one means attacking everyone, is what gives the alliance its teeth. So if Soviet bombers ever attacked York, a city in the north of England, to the US it's just the same as an attack on New York City. And if tanks ever crossed the Rhine to ultimately attack Paris, France, it might as well be an attack on Paris, Texas. And here's something that often gets lost in this debate. NATO is a defensive alliance with a specific geographic area it covers. Article 5 says it can only be triggered by an armed attack on a member state's territory, and Article 6, the treaty defines exactly where that is. Because a lot of the founding members in 1947 still had massive empires they were beginning to wind down across Africa and Asia. NATO only covers member territories in Europe, North America, Turkey, and islands in the North Atlantic north of the Tropic of Cancer. South of that line, Article 5 doesn't apply. When Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in 1982, Britain was all by itself in the South Atlantic. If North Korea were to launch a missile at Hawaii, because it's in the Pacific, NATO wouldn't be used, although other alliances could theoretically kick in. So NATO isn't a tool for the United States to use whenever it wants to intervene somewhere in the world. It's not some backup squad to use to carry out foreign policy whims of whoever the American president is at the time. Vietnam wasn't a NATO operation. Iraq in 2003 wasn't a NATO operation. And the strikes on Iran earlier this year aren't a NATO operation. So when Trump called on allies to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz after the fact, they refused. And then Trump called NATO useless and its member cowards. But the Strait of Hormuz isn't in the North Atlantic. And no matter how you spin it, the US was not attacked by Iran. When people complain that allies haven't done enough, they often mean allies haven't signed on to American military ventures that have nothing to do with collective defense. Because those are two very different things. And it didn't help that Trump didn't even give NATO leaders a heads up about Iran. I don't know how you can honestly expect help half a world away when Macron in France or Merz in Germany hear about it on the news like the rest of us. But what has the US actually gotten out of NATO? Let's start with the budget. The US contributed roughly 16% of NATO's common budget in 2024. It also represents about 53% of the entire bloc's gross domestic product. The largest economy in the alliance by far is paying 16% of a shared pot, the same percentage as Germany, whose economy is only about a sixth of the size of America's. And even if the United States funded the entire NATO common budget on its own, around $5 billion, that number would represent less than 0.5% of total American defense spending. And this is the number that Trump and Republicans seem to be confused about. American defense spending does go to shoring up Europe, but that military spending has always been a domestic decision. The United States spends more on its military than the next 9 countries combined, and that's largely thanks to Republicans. You're not going to get a ton of pushback from Democrats on cutting the Pentagon's budget. And it also doesn't help the argument that Trump is now asking Congress for a $1.5 trillion defense budget, a 44% increase over current spending. The claim that NATO is too expensive falls apart when you want to spend dramatically more in the same category, hundreds of times more than we spend on NATO alone. It's sort of like complaining that we're spending too much on eating out when you're the one eating lobster and filet mignon 10 times a week, but blame everything on that one time the kids wanted to go to McDonald's. But the financial return goes well beyond avoiding a bad deal on a shared budget. Just consider what European NATO membership has meant for American defense contractors. The UK's Royal Air Force operates Boeing F-35s at roughly $109 million each. The French Army uses machine guns manufactured by GE. The Royal Netherlands Navy has purchased Tomahawk missiles. And for over 75 years, European allies have spent billions and likely trillions altogether on American-made military equipment. NATO just didn't give the US security partners, it gave America a captive market. And this also doesn't count almost a century of having close, relatively wealthy trade partners with similar cultures and mostly capitalist economies buying American goods from Levi's to Macs to Big Macs. And then there's Article 5 itself. In the 77 years of NATO, it's been invoked exactly once. Not to defend a European ally as originally envisioned, it was invoked in 2001, after the US was attacked on September 11th. NATO allies flew missions over American skies in the days after the attacks, and they deployed to Afghanistan alongside American forces. Roughly 1,000 NATO allied troops were killed, so when America needed its allies, they showed up. So to say they've done nothing but mooch off of us is quite honestly disgusting. But it makes sense when you consider everything a transaction like Trump. But does any of this mean the alliance is perfect? No. The burden sharing debate is real, so is the question of what NATO's strategic mission looks like now that the Soviet Union no longer exists, although Putin sort of killed that debate when he invaded Ukraine in 2022. But the argument that NATO has been a bad deal for the US requires ignoring pretty much all of the evidence. It confuses the common budget with the full cost of American defense commitments like the Pacific Fleet or Space Force, and it ignores the return on investment from allied military procurement and discounts 75 years of economic benefit from a stable allied Europe. And the most uncomfortable question is what happens when the US walks away, and that question isn't really hypothetical anymore. Trump has already ordered troops out of Germany with threats of deeper cuts in Spain and Italy. Congress pushed back, passing a provision in the 2026 Defense Authorization Bill, blocking reductions below a certain level without congressional approval. But legal guardrails only go so far when a president is determined to do what he wants, and since Trump tends to do what he wants regardless of the law or norms. An Article 5 pledge backed by an unwavering nuclear superpower with thousands of warheads means something. The same pledge from an alliance whose leading member calls it useless means considerably less. Europe is reckoning with this in ways that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. Macron's push for strategic autonomy, or the ability to respond strongly to a threat without American involvement or approval, is now being treated as a blueprint. Germany's reversed decades of post-war defense policy, largely fueled by the shame of World War II, and committed to significant rearmament. Poland is now spending roughly 4% of its GDP on defense, more than any other NATO member, and more than double the old 2% baseline. At the Hague Summit in June of 2025, all 32 members met the 2% floor for the first time in the alliance history and committed to pushing towards 5% by 2035. And if you're wondering, the US currently spends around 3.4% of GDP on our military, and that number will rise to about 4.8% if Trump gets that $1.5 trillion defense budget through. So a European defense organization that operates without the US is now being planned for in earnest. Whether Europe can actually get there is a different question, though. The cultural, institutional, and logistical barriers are real. Building something that approaches the scale of a US-backed NATO from scratch, on a compressed timetable, while managing 30-something national governments with competing interests, isn't a small project. But with signs of America in the West pulling out, while Russia is invading neighbors to Europe's east, Europe has some incentive to act. The US has largely bankrolled NATO since its inception due to Americans spending tons more on our military than anyone else. But we've gotten that investment back many times over, in direct military procurement, in the trade relationships a stable Europe made possible, and in the one and only time Article 5 has ever been invoked, when American allies showed up without hesitation. Leaving that arrangement behind or neutering it through neglect or hostility is a strategic gamble with consequences that will take years to fully understand. And that's NATO, its history, and what both Europe and the US get out of it. If you want to keep following this as it develops, subscribe and hit the bell. I cover something involving transatlantic relations every week or so. And subscribe or comment on what you'd like covered. It really helps the algorithm expand the reach, and we grow and get bigger and better.